David Schnall with us. It's also a pleasure to see that really this new series on changing Jewish communal policies and attitudes draws attention because this is a program, even though the center was in the days of the founder, the late Professor Daniel Al-Azhar, was the leading center in the world in Jewish community studies. The center has not been very active in this field, unfortunately, in the last few years. We are trying to revive these activities because the communities are changing very fast, and I'm glad that I said last time when we had John Rusquet here that I was searching for some seed money, that we now have gotten this seed money to turn this series really in an ongoing series this year, and also start with a few modest publications on the line of the post-Holocaust and anti-Semitism series. Those of you who are not regular guests of the center and who want to be invited into to come to the future lectures of this series and also receive the publications when we start them, please, this is Elizabeth, project coordinator of the projects, of several of the projects we are running. Leave your card with her, or those who have already given their cards to me, they don't have to. The ones who are on our regular list for another program, they will receive the invitations normally. I also, before I introduce Professor Schnall, I also want to draw the attention of those who belong to our post-Holocaust and anti-Semitism program that on the 6th of December, Itamar Marcus will speak here on seeding hatred, the indoctrination of Palestinian children, the image of the Jew in the Palestinian media, and he will illustrate that with video clips. The next lecture in the Changing Jewish Communities will be by Steven Windmuller on the history and the development of Jewish political advocacy in the United States on Monday the 20th of December. In January, so thanks to Howard, Weisband of the Yeshiva University, who are the joint sponsors of the lecture of Professor Schnall with us, we will also jointly have the Dan El-Azhar Memorial Lecture in January, and there Richard Joel, the president of the Yeshiva University, will speak. Well, now, David, it's very nice to have you. David is the dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration at YU. His latest book is By the Sweat of Your Brow, Reflections on Work and the Workplace in Classic Jewish Thought. And to draw your attention, that also in the Jewish Political Studies Review, we have published an essay of David in the past, and I'm very, very glad that he is again with you. He will speak on the changing educational policies in light of the findings of the 2000-2001 National Jewish Population Survey.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. There are so many old friends and distinguished colleagues here that I hesitate to note anyone by name. Please don't be offended for not having been recognized. I recognize you all, and I am honored and a bit humbled by your presence here today. And of course, making a presentation under the guidance, once again, of a dear friend and respected colleague and mentor, Dan, who was someone with whom I was close, particularly during the later years. It is very special, both to be here as part of his legacy, and also for you to be joining with us as well today. It's really very, very kind. I thank you for the kind introduction. Many of you may have heard the story immortalized in various reflections of Yiddish literature first of the town of Chelm, which I think has become legendary. The story, for those of you who may not know about the progenesis of the town, the story is that at creation, the good Lord distributed foolishness more or less, or his intent was to distribute foolishness more or less randomly throughout the Jewish population. And so he assigned a particular angel with a sack of souls and told him to simply sprinkle them throughout the various towns, particularly of Western and Eastern Europe. The angel was no scholar himself, apparently. He got lost in a storm, he bumped his head, there was a fog, and as a result, the entire sackload ended up on this one small town that has been recalled ever after as the center of Jewish foolishness, the town of Chelm. And so the story is of several Chachmei Chelm, several scholars of Chelm, who were searching late one night under a lamppost, a street light. Searching and searching, sifting through all sorts of muck and mire, until a third fellow came over to them and he said, Chaim Yankel, what are you guys looking for? And so they looked up and they said, oh, Mendel, hi, how are you? We are looking, Chaim's wife here has lost her diamond wedding band. And we're looking for it, we're hoping to find it. Oh, did she lose the wedding band here? No, she lost it around the corner down the alleyway near the garbage can. So if she lost it around the corner down by the alley near the garbage can, so why are you looking here? Fool. We're looking here because this is where the light is. We spend a great deal of time in social science looking where the light is. It's easier, it's simpler. One knows, one thinks one knows what he or she finds. There's less vagueness. The only problem is that if you only look where the light is, you're not likely to turn up much jewelry. There will be very few gems. It's necessary for us to search through the muck and the mire where there is very little light, in the hope of turning up something valuable, which by the morning may be nothing more than an old boot. That's part of the attempt that I'd like to make with you today. On the one hand, to take a look where the light is, that is to say, to take a look at some of the data that we have gathered, that has been gathered, about the Jewish community broadly, and more specifically as we move through this, about its implications for various facets and aspects of Jewish education, and then to attempt certain inferences that we hope may speak to changes in policy or changes in direction, whether on the micro level, within the classroom, within the individual school, more so, I think, on the macro level, within communities. I have certain biases. They reflect both my training, not in education per se, but much more so in social science and political science. I wasn't real good at that, and so they put me into education, which is a terrible thing to say. Being ahead of the curve very often simply means being pulled out of what you're not effective, and one hopes elsewhere where you will have less impact. That being the case, I would like to invite you to participate in what is really an exploratory attempt with regard to some data that I have replicated and organized, which I will distribute in a few moments, both for your insights and for the inferences that you will make with me, I hope, and also for some of the directions and the policy implications, which is really what we're about here, and much more difficult and much less grounded. Most of you, I expect, are familiar with the study part now of, how shall I say, something of a ritual in American Jewish life, and through that as well in various facets of the world Jewish community. The original study, which was intended to be linked to the 10-year cycle of the American census, was undertaken back in 1970-71. I think that was the first one under these auspices by what was then called as the Council of Jewish Federations, has undergone its own changes, with dual intent. Number one, it was a marketing study, quite candidly, an interest in searching out the best opportunities for fundraising, searching out the best opportunities for support, both organizational as well as financial, and then on the other hand, in order to do needs analysis, to get a sense of what was required, what people said they needed, where the various directions of the community suggested that allocations and support might best be applied. 1990 survey probably has made the greatest impact of any individual piece of research within Jewish communal life for its what it showed us about questions of intermarriage, questions of assimilation, questions of affiliation. The banner of that particular study spoke a great deal about an intermarriage rate for those who married within the last 5 years, the 5 years just prior to that survey, over 50%, suggesting for those younger cohorts that intermarriage was a given, a majority. There's some question as to whether or not that was really an accurate or a fair, or on the other hand, an erroneous inference. That it was very, very high, that the rates were shocking. There's no question about that. Not only that the rates were shocking, but that they were growing at shocking proportions. The estimate was that intermarriage rates, by whatever definition, were under 10% in the 50s, that they had grown by the 1970 survey to about 25 to 30%, and that by the 1990 survey, some 20 years, one generation later, they had grown to something approaching 50%, if not exactly the figures. And so it was not only the actual number, but also the trend that was shocking. Which leads us to the year 2000 Jewish population survey, which will be the core of our discussions today. Now, this mic, forgive me, is for purpose of recording or amplification?
Amplification.
Okay. Can you guys hear me if I walk around a little bit? Is that I just find microphones terribly, terribly restrictive. Also, anything that I want to say that should not be recorded, I can walk away from the mic. But apparently, that's not an issue here. I can take the mic with me. Exactly.
Or we have a portable one if you.
Well. Let's see if we can manage this way. If not, then because I will invariably trip over the wiring. It's a pleasure then to take a look now at what the most recent data seem to suggest. But you need to know a few things about the data, which probably have been well publicized. Firstly, again, it's part of this same sequence intended to work in tandem with the census, the United States Census. Number two, the data were gathered during the winter and spring prior to the September of 2001. Okay, the last data were gathered during the summer of 2001. That means, number one, that these data were gathered before September 11th. That means that these data were gathered before the current Intifada. That means that these data were gathered before the American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. That, I think, probably would have a profound effect on different sets of issues than those that we're looking at today. There were questions in the survey that dealt with political values and political attitudes. There were questions that dealt with support for Israel. There were questions that dealt with a whole host of value-driven issues. Here, the questions that we're going to be looking at had much more to do with demography, had much more to do with social practice, had much more to do with prior education. And I don't think that those were terribly would have been terribly influenced by subsequent events of the last 2.5 or 3 years. I hope not. That's why I feel a little bit more confident taking a look at these data now, despite the events, despite the venue and the timing of the studies themselves. The survey itself questioned or included some 5,000 households. It's very, very expansive. There's one disadvantage to that. For those of you who are statistically inclined, one question that invariably you should ask, are these particular data statistically significant? Any given table that we will look at, and they're basically crosstabs, is there statistical significance at whatever level, 0.05, 0.01? And the problem with having such a large sample is that almost everything is statistically significant. And that's much more driven simply by the sample size than necessarily by the trend or the direction of the data themselves. As I have often noted to my students who are shocked by the suggestion, because for them, whether or not something is significant becomes the beginning and the end of the story, that something can be statistically significant and realistically meaningless. And that's a painful reality that those of us who deal in social science have come to appreciate, especially since almost everything today is data-driven, and that leaves a great deal to be desired for the humanistic perspectives that I think a prior generation would have had, would have introduced and would have been much more effective. So yes, the data are statistically significant, but so what? One other piece of information here, and that has to do with what is really the fundamental question of identification, a question that the Israeli society has dealt with for decades, and that has less bothered, for a variety of reasons, American Jews, and that is simply the question of who is a Jew. For our purposes here, who should be and who should not be included in a survey of the Jewish population in the United States. And I must say, by way of beginning, that if the Israeli government and the chief rabbinate cannot quite come to terms with the question, or conclusively, of who is a Jew, then what do you want from a group of social scientists in New York and Washington? And so they came up with a whole host of definitions in terms of affiliation, in terms of belongingness, in terms of heredity, which left a gap that allows us to say that either there are 5.5 million Jews in the United States or there are 8.5 million Jews in the United States, depending on who's doing the counting and what the definition would be. Surveys such as this included households in which only one member of the household could be identified by traditional standards as Jewish. And others were married with a conversion, married without a conversion, married with a conversion with children who were not converted, up to and including when people were asked to identify their denominations. So a good majority, a waning majority, but a good majority still chose one of the 3 or 4 main streams of Judaism, the fastest growing among whom, by the way, are the Reform movement. A second group chose none of the above, which is the fastest growing of all of the choices, and then a whole host of others chose things like Lutheran and Methodist and secular, and nevertheless were being included in this study, so that it's possible to be Jewish even if you are avowedly non-Jewish, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. We have identified probably 300,000 to 400,000 people who are born Jewish who are now practicing some other faith. And I leave it to your theological insights as to whether they are or are not still part of the community and should or should not be included in a study such as this. This also says nothing at all about the devastating question of conversion. What is conversion? Who has the right to officiate over conversion? What should be the consequences of conversion? Although I will add one interesting phenomenon, and that is that the instance of conversion in cases of intermarriage is something less than 5%. So that for all the noise, and I think it's been appropriately noted that the question is not who is a Jew, the question is who is a rabbi, that for all of the noise and upheaval and confrontation that we have faced, both here and where I come from, on the question of conversion, that the impact itself is really minuscule, and that perhaps we ought to think about communal policy that would encourage conversion in a variety of different ways in cases of intermarriage, which means coming to terms with intermarriage as a reality. And I appreciate that in many parts of, that there is ideological opposition to that in many parts of the Jewish community, including the part of the Jewish community that I come from. I appreciate the suggestion that it may not make sense. It may be more important for us simply to take a stance that is opposed to conversion and, to intermarriage, and that does not offer any accommodations whatsoever, flying in the face of the reality that there is a growing rate of conversion in which there are these kinds of unusual family mixes, and if nothing else creates all sorts of havoc for sociologists who are attempting to count the Jewish community. Much of the data that you will be looking at with me here emerges from the narrower definition of who is Jewish, which gives us about 5.5 million Jews in the United States, which includes those who are Jews by religion, as well as those who are born Jewish but now practice no religion, rather than those who are born Jewish but practice some other kind of religion. It's not quite what the halachists would prefer, but it's probably the closest of all the demographic and ideological definitions to the classic understanding of who is a Jew. Jewish by birth, not practicing some other type of religious affiliation, but giving either no affiliation for religion or giving Jewish as their affiliation. And that whittles down the community to about 5.5 million or so. Let me distribute some of these and give you a moment or two to take a look at them. I have duplicated about 25, and that may mean that some of you, shituf pa'ula, is that a very common term today? Some of you may have to...
Common term, uncommon practice.
Uncommon
One behind
practice,
it.
ineffective. It's a minority. It's a minority opinion. Well put. During...
We always believe in power sharing in this place.
Power sharing.
The founder of
The European experience, I think, rather than American. So again, I don't know that there are enough. I'm pleased to see that there are not enough, actually. I take it as a personal compliment. I learned a good deal about some of these new Israeli phrases during my time here a few years back as a Fulbright professor at Hebrew University. One story remains with me. I learned new Israeli phrases like role model, opziot, asher lono opziot. My daughter was in a local Israeli school during the year that we were here, and one story comes to mind in particular that's illustrative. Two of her friends were sitting in class, and this was quite a devastating experience for her in general, a ninth grader at that time. One said to the other, "Ma ze dilemma?" And the other one turned to her and said, "At yodat ze kamo konflikt kazer." Ma ze dilemma, ze kamo konflikt. So you'll excuse me then if I bend here and there to some of the new phrases, and my son was on a plane, El Al flight back to New York, and the purser was going about and he was instructing the various attendants. He said to one of them, "Lesakmel ota pol, lesakmel po, sakmel vakasha, od lo sikmalt," and that's a word he didn't know, sakmel, sikmalt. And so he turned to this fellow and he said, what does that mean, sakmel? And he pulled out his registry and he said, SKML, special kosher meal. So much for classic Hebrew. What I've done here is organize, some of which is original to me, some of which is borrowed from the work of somebody I expect you know well, Steve Cohen. Some of which is borrowed from the executive summaries that were generated by the United Jewish Communities, the successor to the Council of Jewish Federations. Some of it, a good deal of it, is of general nature, and as we move ahead, it focuses more and more specifically on questions of Jewish education. I don't know that we're going to be able to do all that we have until 4 in the afternoon, is that correct? My watch still says 3:30, actually. So I apologize if there's too much here, and you're certainly welcome to take a look at it on your own, and I will be happy to be in touch with anyone who has some insights that you would like to add. The first tables simply talk about the question of how many and by what definition, and compare where we are now with where we were 10 years ago. And indicate that there has been, by the definitions we have offered, a fall-off of Jewish population. It's not radical, it's not devastating. I am old enough to recall projections that were made back in the in the mid-70s, late 70s, that by the end of the millennium, by the year 2000, there would be no more than perhaps 100,000 Jews left in the United States, and one really over-the-top suggestion that there would be under 50,000 Jews in the United States, and we're counting at least 5 or 5.5 million, and that's by the narrowest definition. So we are an ever-dying people, as it has been noted, and we are continuing despite all of our own worst projections. And the point is well taken. But what you may see in these first shots are, on the one hand, an increase in Jewish households, or approximately the same, slight increase in Jewish households, and yet a decrease in the number of Jews in those households. And so, of course, the question of definition, in this case, a Jewish household included someone who was Jewish by definition, but also included lots of other people in its intent. And the second table also tells you another very important story that we have known for quite a while, and that is that the Jewish community is an aging community in the United States, rapidly aging community. We estimate that the Jewish community in the United States is the oldest ethnic or faith community. Thank you very much. The oldest ethnic or faith community in our country. By comparison, as you can see here, the median age for Jews is 42 years. They estimate the median age for the general United States Census is 35 years. The median age for the black population in the United States is approximately 29 or 28 years, and the median age for Hispanics, which is the youngest ethnic community in the United States, is something around 24 years. And so the Jewish community is not quite, but almost twice the age of the youngest. That's good news. We're living longer, and it's good to see that. And part of why we are living longer in the United States is directly related to economic overtones. We are wealthier. We are more likely. By the way, there are estimates that suggest that the Jewish community is also the most affluent of all ethnic and faith communities in the United States, which is something when I say to an American Jewish audience that they ask me please not to say very loud and not to say very clearly, that it only will bring bad feeling and ultimately anti-Semitism. Because we are an affluent community, we live longer, we're more likely to have health care, we're more likely to have a private physician, we're more likely to have access to a variety of different supports. But we are also an older community because we have a large out-migration through intermarriage, and therefore in the middle of the age cohorts there is a gap. And we are also an older community, as you will see in the next page, because we are not populating. That is to say, our people marry later. If they marry at all, they're more likely to remain unmarried. Our people have fewer children, if they have children at all. And as a result, in the youngest age cohorts, we are devastatingly lacking. There are strong gaps, and you can see that in tables 3, 4, and 5. And just with Manfred's permission, perhaps another word or two about these first few tables, and then if anyone wants to offer a question or a thought, is that an acceptable modality?
Sure.
Okay. Any insights that you offer? I am interested because, as I say, this is as much exploratory and tentative for me, part of an ongoing analysis. I've been playing with these data for almost a year now. I'd like to get a fresh look every once in a while. Tables 3, 4, and 5 give you an idea of the age distributions and the question of fertility. As you can see in Table 3, the number of people ever married, comparing by age, comparing men and women with the general population, the general American population. And you can see that, for example, at or around the second cohort, 25 to 34, 48% of American Jewish men have been married, 59% of men generally have been married, 64% of women, Jewish women versus 70% of the general U.S. population, in the younger cohort as well. As we continue, until the oldest, even ages 35 to 44, there is a lag between those who marry in the Jewish community. They are marrying later, and those and marriage rates, which, by the way, have also been expanding. That is to say, the age of marriage in the general American population has also been driven up. Even more so, Jews are perfect examples of the American population, only more so. It's been suggested, I think Arthur Hertzberg suggested that. In the same vein, he also said Jews are people who can never take yes for an answer. The point is well taken. So there is a tendency to marry later, and if often where there is a tendency to marry later, the tendency is followed by no marriage at all. By the way, just if you'll allow me an aside with that as well, a lot of the studies of intermarriage that were done or that emerged from the 1990 census and that you will see emerging in some of our discussion here did not take into account the fact that a growing number of intermarriages took place on second marriage. That's something that sort of eluded many of those who said, why did that happen? Because it's easier in the strictures of American Jewish life to marry out when one is older, when children probably are no longer an issue, when parents probably are no longer an issue. And so many of those intermarriages were not first marriages, and that has implications as well. Percent of childless, and you can see here again that not only are Jews marrying